I call the Honourable Member, Dr Paul Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for the opportunity to speak on this Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill, which is highly important. This bill is part of the government's war against amphetamine. It is part of a 5-part plan. As the Law Commission pointed out in its very worthwhile review of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975, unfortunately there are no silver bullets. It is important that the issues relating to banning drug utensils do not distract from the major thrust of this bill, which is to restrict access to precursor chemicals that pure methamphetamine is made from. The bill will reclassify both ephedrine and pseudoephedrine as Class B2 controlled drugs and establish the presumption of supply at 10 grams. Mr Speaker, everybody in this House knows something of the horrors of P or pure methamphetamine. It's highly addictive, it's associated with gang activity, and it can ruin young lives. Pure methamphetamine undoubtedly affects every strata of New Zealand society, and certainly it costs. The Burl study estimated the cost to New Zealand, other than alcohol, of drugs to be about $1.58 billion, and the accounts were that $1 billion was attributed to methamphetamine. Over the last 2 years in Pukekohe, part of the area I represent, the community was absolutely stunned and shaken when an elder statesman chemist, he was also an elder of the Presbyterian Church, a Rotarian, was convicted for dealing in precursors of pure methamphetamine. Whether he was coerced by gangs, nobody really knows what the circumstances were, but it illustrates very much that every strata of New Zealand society can be involved in drugs, however unexpected. Local police tell me that anywhere in the vast rural electorate of Hunua that I represent, within 10 kilometres, one could probably find a clandestine laboratory, and of course we have heard many stories of explosions from these clam labs. In fact, there was one in Glenbrook in my electorate just some months ago with the loss of life. Mr Speaker, the Health Select Committee worked collaboratively and well on this bill, but there were differences of opinion regarding or relating to drug utensils and their parts. But I emphasise the major issue or thrust of this bill is to restrict methamphetamine precursors. We were informed by the Chief Scientist's report that at least 10% of pure methamphetamine in New Zealand had its source from precursors obtained within New Zealand. The police, however, gave a much higher estimation that something like 30% of precursors from cold, cough mixtures, etc., were found when they busted the clam labs around New Zealand. Sir Peter Gluckman told us that there were safe and effective alternatives to pseudoephedrine. Phenylephrine is a safe alternative. Anecdotal evidence suggests it mightn't be quite as good, and I would concur personally with that. However, there's no doubt in my mind that the overwhelming view of the government is correct, that placing restrictions on these precursors is absolutely justified. The Pharmaceutical Society of New Zealand submitted that there might be other options than restricting it to doctors' prescriptions only, but again, I'd reiterate, I think the government's policy is absolutely appropriate. There is an 8-year jail term that is brought in once they are reclassified as Class B drugs, and this shows the absolute importance with which the government regards the restriction of these drugs. We were told that packets of cold and flu remedies containing pseudoephedrine can have up to 1.44 grams of active ingredient, but the more common types have much less than this. Even at the higher levels, a presumption of supply of 10 grams would allow around 7 boxes of pseudoephedrine tablets, so it's a fair amount. Another important point is the Attorney General's report states that the bill contravenes Section 5 of the Bill of Rights, but he cites the Courts versus Hanson's, and the majority in Hanson concluded that the control of the supply of illegal drugs is a pressing social objective which might justify limitations on rights and freedoms in the Bill of Rights, and accordingly the Attorney General stated, "I've concluded the bill's objective is sufficiently important and significant." The issues relating to restricting further the importation of incomplete utensils and their parts and banning their advertising was controversial, and there were many submissions against this being enforced. There was a fear that it would drive underground, or these legislative changes would drive underground the trade in these utensils, and that unsuitable substitutes would easily be made. I took the trouble to visit the hemp store in Auckland, and I must admit I was amazed at the variety of drug utensils and paraphernalia that were available there. And on discussions with the owner of that store, or one of the manager of that store, Chris Fowley, he made the point that a change in law would be hard to police. However, both the police themselves and customs were absolutely adamant that such moves as are in this bill will assist them in enforcing our drug laws and in tracking down illegal importations. It's also important to mention the Law Commission's report on controlling and regulating drugs. This is an incredibly important body of work that needs serious review for the future. Mr. Speaker, we do have to look at better rehabilitation at New Zealand, at minimising harms and at prevention, but we must have clear messages in our fight to stop illegal drugs use in New Zealand. I'm sure that everyone in this House will welcome the Honourable Peter Dunn's announcement last night that he will introduce an SOP at the committee stage to deal with synthetic cannabinoids. I know that thousands of parents up and down the country will breathe a sigh of relief when the ever-expanding range of synthetic cannabinoids are banned from being sold in corner dairies. The manufacturers of these drugs are cunning, intelligent and ruthless. Manufacturers such as Matt Bowden, who has appeared before the Health Select Committee, seem to have little regard for the serious harm he is causing, but lots of regard for the money he is making. The criminals and business people behind the drug trade are utterly ruthless and will stop at nothing. It's very important to counteract them with clear legislation such as this contained within this bill. I look forward to the committee stages. Sorry about that.
I